Okay. Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, I'm Layman Pascal, and this is Love the System, an integral stage podcast series all about our collective interpersonal procedures, systems, technologies, and protocols, everything integral theory inanely calls the interobjective lower right quadrant, and how that stuff can be skewed toward deeper, more complex, and more benign forms. Today, we're going to speak with Avi Tuschman, author of Our Political Nature and the white paper Rosenbaum's Magical Entity, about his proposal that processes analogous to those which govern Wikipedia could be generalized to clean up our degraded information ecology and produce a more robust and useful form of collective digital sense-making. Now, obviously, our civilization is stuck between a rock and a hard place in terms of wanting higher grade, more complex, more truthful information without deplatforming people for their ideologies, ousting outlier science, or carelessly contributing to corporately or politically sourced cancel culture. Our options seem to come down to either doing nothing or letting national governments decide truth for us or letting private corporations decide truth for us. And none of those seem to occur within a system of incentives that's likely to produce both freedom and general well-being. But there seems to be another option, that the users of systems, that the participants could be arranged together to provide highly transparent, highly accurate, and evolving representations of reality like they do on Wikipedia every day and mostly for free. Now, clearly Wikipedia is not perfect, but it might be as good or better than classic encyclopedias, dictionaries, and newspapers of years gone by, so it's definitely worth taking seriously. And here to explain why is Avi Tuschman. Hi, Avi.
Hi, Layman. Thanks. Really appreciate you having me on your podcast.
First, let me say that with the name Avi makes me, I was kind of hoping you would have the voice of like an old Jewish stand-up comedian. Avi. Something like that.
I'm working on getting there little by little. Well, gosh, Layman, I have to say, I'm really impressed by how you articulated the problem. I mean, I almost want to just keep listening to you. That was incredible. You just nailed it.
Well, let's see how we can build on that. And maybe I'll flip this around and pretend I don't know what the problem is, because we're, presumably we've evolved to be somewhat persuadable. So maybe you could try to persuade me of the idea that we need to do anything at all, because we've had a lot of culture scares over the years that turned out not to be as significant as we feared. Video games didn't lead to outbreaks of violence among the youth. There wasn't really a satanic abuse cult thing going on. People don't become rapists and murderers if we don't indoctrinate them into the big religions. So there's a lot of fear around society that didn't come to pass. Why is this serious? Why should we believe the current hand-wringing and anxiety about misinformation and disinformation?
Sure. That's a very fair question. I think it's really kind of come to the front and comes together in a really compelling argument that we should at this point in time, because of the very serious externalities that we've all seen recently on democracies and public health. It is really important when you're talking about different ways to deal with information and sort of sense making, if that's the right term that I've heard, how effectively how people learn and understand the world and what's true and not true, and how to stay safe and have happy, productive lives for themselves and for the other people that they're interconnected with. So you want to be very careful about what the solution is. Make sure that it's not going to create like weird, unexpected results, or like you mentioned, you don't want to limit the freedom of thought. You don't want to contribute to excessive kind of cancellation or fear-based, like sort of these moralistic witch hunts that we see. With some of them, without diving into that, not suggesting that there aren't people that kind of had it coming, and other people where it's a little more complicated, I'm sure. But the point is that with very specific areas like that are really in the public interest, like having democracies that are viable and sustainable over time, and not having some of the worst COVID statistics in the world so far, right? With a little emphasis on so far, because we're still in the thick of it here.
So from your point of view, what have we tried that doesn't work at this point?
Yeah, I think the status quo, which is just kind of let platforms just kind of entirely self-regulate or sort of do like research or come up with solutions that don't really scale, don't really solve the problem, doesn't work. And the risk of so doing nothing is not a great option. And there's even worse risks of doing nothing, which is that encourages in our country in a bipartisan way, which is particularly then it starts to get serious, right? And certainly in other countries where there's more dominant political, more consolidated political power, it's there's other problems, but then you just get more like regulation or job owning or intimidation or kind of manipulation to kind of strong arm the bosses of social media companies to take certain actions. And both of those are not great outcomes. Like I think I'm coming from the perspective, and it's my opinion, and probably a lot of people would sympathize, but I think we want to live in a free and open society with competition of ideas. And at the same time, we want some stability. We don't want democratic safeguards to collapse, and we want to kind of protect each other and minimize the mortality statistics. And I think we are at a soul searching moment in our country where, or we certainly should be questioning, like, what can we do to make it better? Are we going to live with a moral code, an American concept that it's freedom of the absolute, like freedom fundamentalism with no cost, which isn't true anyway. It's kind of like a myth, right? There's a lot of other areas in life. I'm not just referring to like the COVID or mask wearing, whatever, but where you have to do things like get insurance if you're going to drive a car, or get other kind of vaccines if you want to go to school and so forth. But I think we need to rethink, because at a certain point we live in a complicated world with increasingly complicated, and you can't just have you have to rethink things a little bit and find out what's the optimal solution. And so we're at exactly that moment, I think, where it's the right time to think of a third solution, so that we benefit from this incredible digital age and get rid of or minimize and mitigate the parts that have proven to be quite dangerous.
So if this third solution looks something like a generalized version of Wikipedia, then maybe we should get a better sense of how that system operates. From your perspective, how does Wikipedia work? What's it really good at? What's it maybe not so good at? By what means does it get the results that it gets?
So that's a complicated question, and like the kind of short version is in an article that I published. It was really, really hard to write like the short version, but I published it in Fast Company. And then, as you mentioned, there's a long version on the internet on my webpage called Rosenbaum's Magical
Entity.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a while. And so it's complicated, but if I could try to get the real summary, Wikipedia, for being like the 5 largest website outside of some of the Chinese e-commerce giants, but for being such an important massively visited website, is equally misunderstood. There's this kind of wonderful saying that I think a Wikipedia, someone quite knowledgeable, and actually said that it works really well in practice, just not in theory. And in fact, it actually does work in theory. It's just that it's more complicated. It doesn't work well in the folk theory of popular imagination, of how people imagine it works. And part of it's like their tagline that says the free encyclopedia that anyone can edit. Technically true, but like woefully inadequate. The biggest thing people don't understand about Wikipedia is it's a technology, and it's an intelligence, and it's evolved in a little bit of a different way, right? Like when you look at cephalopods, right? They evolved to solve certain kind of problems in a very different way. Maybe they're not they're not as like social as we are, but they're intelligent. And Wikipedia has an intelligence, and it's kind of a hybrid at this point between a whole bunch of interesting forces. So one is that the crowdsourcing part is very important. Another part is there's a lot of collaboration, but there are many different ways to adjudicate conflict on many different levels. There's like maybe like 3 very simple rules that even novices can follow. But at the same time, there's hundreds of pages of effectively common law that the kind of technocrats or what's the word I'm looking for? A smaller body of people that are very dedicated, like kind of higher level Wikipedians, and there's hierarchies, by the way, within that can use and get very specific, and it's evolved. There's also AI. There are these bots that go around and can very, very quickly find vandalism and get rid of that. There's 11 ways to lock a page. I mean, it goes on and on. So it's not that easy, but it's very much worth looking into and understanding. And I think that the take-home lesson, just to jump ahead of all that, is the take-home lesson is that Wikipedia teaches us something that's important to understand, that's a little bit counterintuitive, that I think I would argue we have already learned in some other areas and not yet in this area. So I really like the analogy of actually law. And I'm coming at this as I don't have a legal background, so it's just my layperson's perspective on this, right? But law used to be something where it would come from some kind of authority, right? Like the king or religious court or something like that. And we've come to a point where we believe in some kind of a sacred process that, it's not perfect, but it's what's important is the process. And we're one step behind in knowledge. We still live in a world where knowledge comes from authority, because of somebody's, from whatever reason, of whatever their claimed authority is. And of course, that's important. You can't just throw that out, right? You still have a judge, in general, in the other analogy. But the point is, it turns out that having rules and processes for the summarization of existing knowledge, and it's important to point out here, for those that may not know, but Wikipedia does not. One of their rules is no original research. It's really is a collaboration of summarizing existing knowledge and attributing it to sources with the reputation for accuracy and documenting it. And so that's important. And there are certainly stories and cases where somebody can come in and say, well, I'm a real expert and you have to listen to me, and I know this, but if it doesn't follow the rule, it doesn't make it on there. And there's other cases of people that are just very interested and they follow the rules and look at the research papers, and you don't need to have that authority. But there's so many people, there's so many editors, processes, and safeguards that when you're at a certain level of page, right? And this part's important because sometimes people will say, well, there's something on there, it's not quite right. Well, of course, if there's not a large enough crowdsourcing, right, then it doesn't necessarily work as well. But then again, it's probably not as important, right? And that's something that can be factored into the solution of what parts are referenceable to help solve the social media misinformation problem. There are many, and what I am advocating for here actually involves a lot of constraints and being careful about exactly what parts should be eligible for the kind of open source fact checking by users themselves at scale. Anyway,
no, that's great.
there.
What's what's the main thing that's in that editorial's version of sacred process that is preventing specific parties from being able to manipulate the information, even within the Wikipedia institution or whatever that is? How what's the real safeguard?
I think it's has a lot of layers, and I'm a very heavy consumer. I'm not like deep enough inside of the gears of it that, maybe I'm not, maybe not like the best person to answer that exactly. But I know like that the kind of legitimate disputes that go on between Wikipedians are not what you might think, that they're not like big moral or ideological issues. It's like, what's the right term that's unbiased to talk to some kind of geographical thing where, different countries have different views on it. That's the correct level of, right. But so the community attracts and has people that are trying to be objective, and there's rules about it. So and it should be important to consider there's large countries that have tried to and want to manipulate it. I'm not going to point fingers at any, but there's big superpowers with tons of resources that want to comment on the status of other countries and whether they're countries or not, or or that are in the business of, not in the business, that they have agencies and specialized capabilities for paying attention to information. And so that's another thing here that I think is important to raise a little bit of awareness of, because it might not be something that a lot of people think about, but there's big superpowers that spend a lot more, a lot of time and resource on this. I'm sure country does to some extent as well, but it's like, the whole kind of psychological game or warfare. It's people are impressionable, and it's become cheaper and easier to get people to believe in crazy ideas. I mean, like we saw like this whole QAnon thing, for example, that looks very, very much like the Pizzagate conspiracy. And if you look into that that there's certain like other countries that have a pattern of and certain interests in kind of coming up with the ingredients of what successfully creates viral misinformation for certain strategic purposes, to make to sow confusion or to find the cracks in other societies that they feel threatened by, like our country, and to try to tear us apart.
But we can just observe that for whatever reason, Wikipedia has proven very robust against incentivized hacking and misinformation agents.
Yes, and I would say certainly in English language and in important pages that are notable. And again, usually when I hear people criticize it, it's like, oh, well, usually it comes from people that are like notable enough to have some presence on there, but they don't have, 100 people or more editing their page. So, but when you're talking about anything related to like COVID or climate change or, things that are important, then yes, it works very well, extremely well. The Washington Post, I think, recently called it like a ray of its COVID coverage or summary of information, a ray of sunlight in a sea of pollution. A ray of sunlight in a sea of pollution. It works better than the traditional media do on important topics, because really what feeds traditional media is controversy. That's why something's newsworthy or gets covered in the first place, is because it's controversial. And then there's the kind of fairness doctrine or the legacy of the fairness doctrine, right? Which is where if you're on public airwaves, you kind of have to like cover both sides of the story and give it equal time. And so a lot of journalism, they'll, no matter what happens, they'll try to find someone who disagrees and make it look like it's not biased. The problem is with social media, then you've got much, much larger amounts of content across time and space, and very intelligent algorithms and AI that basically rank by controversy. So if you want to look something up, it's not just what's controversial yesterday in a place relevant to you. It'll go back 5 years and go all the way to Australia to find the most controversial guy who ever talked about vaccines. And put that, like, if you look up like vaccines and autism on YouTube, at least in mine, and maybe it's personalizing it for someone else, but it will go all the way to Australia and pull up this discredited, disbarred guy who wrote like a bunk paper like, why is that first? So it's like controversy on steroids. Um, and Wikipedia doesn't do that. It's got complex technologies and algorithms that filter for verifiability. And if you do look at their article, like on vaccines and autism or on global warming controversy, it is absolutely eye-opening how well it works, how many references there are, how many scientific charts. It produces a very different kind of result. And it's all referenced by hundreds of news stories and peer-reviewed journals. I mean, it's incredible. And so that's what motivated me, is being a heavy user. And I like, I'll admit it, like I do like to look at like videos on YouTube, and I even find myself sometimes looking at some of the interesting ones that get out to a certain fringe, and I'm constantly fact checking them to and that's part of maybe where this idea came from, and also part of the idea of why do we live in a world where website number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4 are all maximizing popularity and have this very uncomfortable, problematic relationship with factuality, and are directly implicated in some of the most serious problems. I would say it's of such great importance because we don't really have a hope of dealing with enough social cohesion, or like the critical mass of people that live in the same world, right? On very basic things like, if you should wear a mask or when. This just isn't happening in some other countries to the same extent. Like countries that we may look at as, we may even look at with some prejudice, like backwards. But what's interesting is even in some like countries that aren't as developed, what they do have is enough identity or social cohesion to kind of agree on some nature of reality and try to solve problems, right? And some better chance of doing that. And it's a little bit disappointing that we haven't been able to do that. And I think if we're going to have, manipulation and coming from a lot of different directions, including some very sophisticated ones, then it's just very dangerous, right? It's there's a lot that we've kind of taken for granted that rests on these assumptions, that the whole idea of like the fourth estate, or the media is gonna like fact check, or that you have a public that lives in the same reality, and can vote, or to keep the parts of our American culture and identity that have been successful.
Well, we need a robust, updated fourth estate, and if we're going to have any hope of manifesting a more coherent population that can actually adapt to the challenges we're facing. But it seems like Wikipedia evolved to respond to a very specific set of challenges. How would you generalize that and apply it to other forms of the information landscape? And what would be the problems in implementing something like that? Like, why would Facebook or Twitter be open to that? And even if they were, how would that be done? How would it operate outside of the specific context in which it evolved to be Wikipedia?
Sure. So there's I think two questions you're asking. One is, what's the motivation? What's the logic that a large social media tech platform would take a step like that? And the second one is, how would they implement it? So starting with the first one, I think there's definitely reason to be a little bit cynical about it, or more pessimistic, and also a little bit more optimistic. That the reason why they haven't done it so easily, and most of them haven't done it at all, and by it I mean open up some portion to large scale open source fact checking by actual users, using those technologies that have successfully evolved to adjudicate verifiability on Wikipedia. The reason why they haven't done that is because they're very, lucrative businesses, and to give up some kind of control or change the business model, like, it's understandable, it's natural that that's not the first idea that comes to you. The reason why they may do that, and why I'm hoping they do that, and I'm saying this as someone who works in tech and grew up in Silicon Valley, and I'm not coming at them like, actually a lot of people criticize companies like the media are not. I just want to emphasize, like, I'm trying to be helpful. I'm trying to propose something that's a real win-win, that's actually technically possible, and that would be a big benefit for those companies. A little bit of the reason is because it's a headache for them to deal with all the bad press and right now they do have immunity under for the third-party content there, right, via Section 230, but and it's uncertain what will happen in the future. But it's got to be. There's a lot of political liability already, and potentially future legal liability and problems, and so I think it's important. And certainly we've seen some efforts that I don't know a great deal about it, but I have actually seen Twitter is, to the best of my knowledge, the first company that has started with something called Birdwatch. Again, all I know is what I've read, which is that it does use users to do it. I don't know exactly how they do it, but I'm so happy to hear that. I hope it's very successful, and that they're leveraging kind of the best of what we've learned in other technologies that happen to be open source as well, right? Which is great. So I wish them a lot of luck, and I hope that the other ones, follow suit. The other reason I think they should do it is because if you do something first, if you take responsibility for that, then you can have designed the system and control it. And I think it's important for something to be viable that it works out for them. And what I would do if I were making the decision is from what's the hat on, if I were an executive at one of those companies, I would say, all right, well, this is a complex problem, and we want to keep most of our system unchanged. We want to keep most of our revenue, don't want to change our business model, don't want to significantly change our algorithm. There's a lot of things that are just total non-starters. So I think you could start with very, very specific areas, which is already the way they operate, right? There's some very limited content that you can't have on there, right? And there's mechanisms to identify and get rid of it. Even Apple said, which is all about privacy. They said, well, yeah, we're gonna go through everyone's iPhone and make sure that they don't have child abuse images on there, right? So there's ways to moderate content when you have to. They already do. And I think expanding a little bit to areas that very specific areas where people are going to get sick or die more because there's dangerous misinformation. I'm saying that not out of speculation. There's very good studies that draw causal relationships between beliefs, the consumption of certain kinds of social media, dangerous behaviors, and of course, health outcomes. So, in that white paper, I say, well, why not start with COVID misinformation? And you can even get more specific. You can start off with certain types of conspiracy theories. And the thing about Wikipedia is it's very good at centralizing that information and cataloging the misinformation and updating it extremely quickly, right? And so that way, the social media companies can control what areas are eligible for outsourced processes and do run pilots on it and use the human judgment to create more data. And obviously, that's going to interact with artificial intelligence. That Wikipedia shows that human judgment and classification can work very, very well. And I think it's the best solution we have that has a great chance of scaling. So, and also I believe that the workforce is there and motivated. There are a lot of people that, one thing I've seen in neuroscience studies is that when you there's this moralistic punishing, right? If someone has misinformation, and you kind of punish that person for it, people will do that for free because you basically get a dopamine incentive in your brain. And a lot of what people are doing on social media for free is what they perceive to be punishing people for, moral transgressions, which could be done in a more scientific kind of productive way than just what goes on there
Do
a lot of
you
the time.
know people who just don't trust Wikipedia at all?
Of course, but
And
that's kind of irrelevant. Well, it's not irrelevant, but let me put this in perspective.
sure.
Yes, there's going to be people that distrust Wikipedia. You know, if you say we're only looking at certain pages, and even social media kind of executive team like a Facebook Supreme Court or something could say, well, these are the problems we're going to solve, and these are the approved pages, and they already have like locks on them, and they've got you know 1,000 editors and 1,000 contributors, and our experts looked at it and vetted it, and it's the information's correct at this point in time, and so it can be controlled. So those people are wrong. Number two, what is the alternative? Well, today you have whenever there's a conflict, the kind of big conflicts, they're very reactive, they're very slow, and there's probably draining a lot of resources and energy for like top executives to kind of figure out what's the right thing to do and talk to their legal teams, and and the reason is it's the top executives making these decisions, and that's not lost on public opinion. It's not lost on Washington, right? That's very much the impression that we get, and that's not the right way to do things. You wind up with arguments between like Tucker Carlson and some executive at Twitter who he thinks has a political bias. That's there's so many things wrong with that. I'm going to like start unpacking it. And it's also not super helpful when there's misinformation just to have like a little blue box that says, hey, learn more about go to some government website. It absolutely should go to Wikipedia, and the more people that are going there and contributing to it and learning about it, that's great. That's exactly what social media decision makers should be doing, is deflecting, and they're doing the opposite. And to be fair, maybe he could have done like a little better job communicating or whatever. But I think that someone like Mark Zuckerberg has been telling us his position on this, and it's kind of blind what I'm saying to some degree. He says we shouldn't be making these decisions. We can't kind of adjudicate what's true or tell people what to think politically or censor. And he's right about that. The problem is, one, a lot of times that's still what's happening, or even if it's not him in particular, and it's like, I mean, look what happened. They hired all these Supreme Court people, these 20 academics and journalists from around the world, and the big decision they have to decide is, should Trump be allowed back on Facebook? And it takes a very long time, and it's too late, and they basically kicked the ball back into his court and said, that's not for us to decide. You figure it out, and take your time, figure it out, like in whatever, like 2 years from now or something, right? So it's a mess. The other thing that can happen is just kind of trying to farm it out to some of these NGO fact-checking organizations, but or having contractors that do this, and it just doesn't. I don't think those as sources are necessarily as convincing, but mostly they're just not scalable, or whatever way it's set up is coming up really short on solving the problem in ways that we don't see on Wikipedia.
You mentioned Section 230. Do you think there's a useful role for government in terms of extending certain kinds of rights and protections to platforms that could employ a better processing and fact-checking and verification system, and using that to incentivize or at least privilege systems that do that?
Yeah. So if I were to put on like my government regulator hat, right? A lot of the kind of check and balance or regulation that you see coming out of government seems more like punitive, trying to nail them on like antitrust or privacy or all these other things. And to me, the most, I mean, I don't want to say that there aren't interesting issues there, but like the one that's actually had like the biggest real world impact, I feel like directly on me and on us, and on our actual lives, is the misinformation one. So I think that's really one of the most important ones. Shouldn't be a surprise if you look at history that, that controlling information is a big deal. It's our whole idea that we just have completely control our destinies and have absolute free will and can do whatever we want and we're not suggestible creatures. It is not very scientific, right? Like it does matter. And there's a lot of this interesting fear of social media and fear of whether we do have free will or not. Like these are old questions. People have been thinking about that for a very long time. But I want to make sure I feel like I'm losing the thread of what you're asking. Oh yeah. So if I were on the government side, what's the right way to try to regulate? Well, one, I think you have to think about incentives, not the concrete solutions, because the problem here is when you just look at the fundamental facts, the scale of it all, like how many hours of video are being uploaded every second on YouTube, right? Like, these companies are going to have to fix the problem themselves. It's fast moving. It's going to require the scalability and massive cloud computing and AI, right? So I think the first suggestion is that they think about incentives. And the second is they should look at what works. And I really want to encourage them. There's a massive strange gap in relationship between Silicon Valley and Washington, or even the other political centers of the world. A lot of like fundraising that goes on between them and a lot of misunderstandings. But and so I'm kind of hoping to create a little bit of a bridge on how this could happen. And so to be, I'm not doing a great job of answering this, getting to the point. But one, think about incentives. Number two, the other important thing is to think about what actually works. What are tech solutions that work, and kind of put in incentives to try new things, right? Like I feel like some of the things that they're experimenting with, like these, nudges or like little like blue boxes and stuff, that doesn't work. It's not a serious intervention, right? That can solve the problem. So I think they need to be very strongly encouraged to try scalable solutions that work, like using their users and these open source systems that work. And then if you want to get more specific, like if you were to change Section 230, right, there are a couple ways you could do that. Well, one is if they do use outsource kind of situation like that's being proposed, that should continue to enjoy immunity, right? When you have a wiki style, or when you're using a process like this, then it should not be in the legal liability of the platform, and that's exactly what they want, right? And the other thing in combination with that is special carve outs, right? Like, well, sure, maybe you can put whatever you want about the Earth is flat or whatever crazy stuff there, but just like you can't have certain kind of harmful images of child abuse, you shouldn't be able to say things that at that point in time are very demonstrably false. Like you're not immune from saying 5G radiation or whatever like causes COVID. That's kind of like a black and white thing. There's studies showing people believe that, and then they don't follow the rules and they get sick and they get other people sick. So I think reform to Section 230 should think about those two things, right? Specific areas that maybe should be exempted from the protection, and particular mechanisms that could actually work effectively at scale should also be exempted. At the same time, maybe if you're not doing that and it does work, then maybe some of that immunity for certain areas could get removed. Again, it's complicated. So I am hopeful that they just solve this problem, that they get tired of trying to do it the other way. And I think there's a better way to move forward on it.
So here's a question that's very subjective, but what do you think is the bigger risk to the information ecology? Is it gullible, mythologically minded people weaving paranoid alternative realities? Is it active disinformation meant to destabilize and deceive, or arrogant, conformist institutional narratives that just assume they're correct and dismiss everyone else as irrational and anti-science? Like, which of those are you most scared of?
Not the last one as much, because it's very hard to control information in an open society without like barriers to content creation and stuff. So not that one so much, as long as we are kind of living in a democracy where people are allowed to write their thoughts and feelings within reasonable limits. The second one, I would say not so much. Sure, there's very successful people that are caught up in these conspiracies, and those are a higher concern. But an even bigger one is really not that kind of misinformation, but the state-sponsored disinformation that is interconnected with and influencing the people that get caught up in it, and that kind of co-opts their minds. Right. That's serious. And you read about it in the news. I think people are a little bit more aware of it, but that's a serious issue. The state, just like state-sponsored hacking, is a very serious issue. And these are issues that you kind of have to read about and think about. You might not see them, but when you really like understand the implications, right, of those of what's going on, they're serious. It's not maybe like physical war, but there's a lot at stake.
There's clearly a big risk when it comes to populations not being able to accurately figure out what's real and not being able to get on the same page in terms of agreements that would allow them to respond to what's real. Mm-hmm. But we live in an age, the post-truth world, so to speak. Do you think there's some virtue in not trusting social information? Do you think there's been some advantages in terms of people learning to not believe what's in the news and not believe what's coming to them from authority, and just be have an ontology of suspicion more so than they used to?
Boy, that's a big question that I want to think about more. But my very first reaction and gut feeling is that's a bad thing when people start distrusting kind of authority and mainstream news sources. And it's something that we've seen happen in countries that have trust issues with their populations, authoritarian countries, on the left and on the right. And I mean, you see people coming out of those countries that come to our country, and those people are especially susceptible to disinformation. And so it's a problem. So anytime you lose trust between kind of and the legitimacy of authority, it's very bad and dangerous, and opens up fertile ground for manipulation. And it's a problem. Yeah.
I don't know if you have kids, but given the fact that these kinds of proposals would take time to implement, even if we decided to implement them, how do we help people who are coming up into the society today? Like, I don't know if you have a sense of this, but what forms of skill building would you assume would be important in order to be, anti-fragile and emotionally stable and non-hysterical and capable of making sense of the world, regardless of how our major platforms turn out to be managed going forward?
Yeah, so I do a little bit on the younger side, just learning to talk, not quite hooked on the screen or getting screen time yet, but enough to think about. Gosh, I don't know if I want. I don't know if I don't want certain kind of exposure to things that I don't think will make my daughter happier by spending more time looking at it, or that will so I think what you're bringing up is the question of education and what's the role of education. Education is really, really important, and actually I'm going to say, now that I've kind of thought about this question before to answer, but now at this particular time, for whatever reason, I'm leaning toward it's a little bit more important than I've said it was maybe the last time I answered it, right? What I usually say on this is, yes, education is super important, but it's much easier to solve these problems by prevention and making sure that that stuff's not out there, because you really don't want to underestimate the suggestibility of people and their biases, right? And if you tell people stuff they want to believe, and you've got sophisticated large amounts of data and algorithms that can figure that out, it's hard. It's really hard. I mean, you can have some of the most educated people in the world, even like world-renowned physicians. We've seen recently an interesting case where they just have their own ideological bias gives them causes them to have medical opinions outside of their area of medicine. They're just crazy and wrong because of ideological bias. So it's just astounding. Like, even as somebody who's studied and written about and done a lot of research on the perceptual, moral, and ideological biases in our human, like software, so to speak, it's still kind of eye-opening seeing, some of what we've seen over the past years. It's different than reading the textbook examples of stuff that happened in the past, when you're right there in the moment. So definitely, like, my main message is prevention over trying to combat it with education, because actually there's research from my field that I read, our political nature, about suggesting that just general education makes people more polarized in the direction that their personality was leaning in. You get more literate, you read more, and you people, like, you get more ideological coherence, and a little bit can get more biased. However, the reason why I'm having like a little bit of an additional thought here is, I do think that when I look back at my life experience, I think there's definitely a positive impact of education, especially as people get more of it. When they get, I think there's two particular areas. One, that I've seen help kind of change people. It's hard to know the cause and effect, right? But one is you get more study leads people more to the edge of knowledge, and hopefully gives them a little bit more humility about what's known and what's not known, right? The opposite of that, I forget what it's called, that thing where you think you know all the answers, you don't. That one, yeah, like that's a fascinating real thing. That's
So the other thing is people that are in challenging areas, like in science, where there's a lot that we don't know, and where nature itself is imposing a certain humility on a reasonably minded person, right? There's some kind of, I don't know, maybe like I'm thinking of that Greek philosopher. Is it the one who said, is it Plato? I'm like a smart guy because I know how much I don't know. I'm thinking in connection of that with, sometimes people at the top of their fields, there are certain issues where everyone will kind of have a lot of opinions, or say, well, gosh, there's a lot we don't really know about COVID, and not saying that in sort of a biased way, like saying that because we for some purpose, but like, well, there's some legitimate things we don't understand. We don't understand like why it's mutating, how fast, or why it's peaking at certain times, certain places, and just kind of admitting that it's complicated, and we should have like some greater level of humility or like intellectual honesty about what do we know and what do we not know, and it changes over time. So I do think education plays an important role, and those are the two things where I've seen combat that Dunning-Kruger, is having more of it and being in certain areas where if you're serious about studying things, unless you're like being arrogant or insecure and like but if you're not like that, then you look at it and say, wow, it's impressive how much we've learned, and we're learning a lot, but I mean, it's science and there's so much we don't know, and you really have to respect that. And I think that's a mindset. It's a way of approaching the world. It's a way of asking, how do we know what we know? How certain are we? Is the answer tomorrow going to be different than it is from today? And that's okay. That's part of the scientific process. It's all worthy, right? There's some directionality, right? There's some improvement over time in our ability to understand what the cause and effect is, and what kind of outcomes to expect. And so, yeah, education's important, but it's certainly doesn't scale, unfortunately, to the scale that we need to solve this problem. I hate to say that, but I feel like it's an important practical constraint.
Seems like there's some parallel between the individual attitude of appreciating what we don't know and the complexity of situations, and how do we know? How do I know what I know? And what we've been talking about in terms of Wikipedia, because that's a system that seems designed to harness multiple participants to challenge each other with conflicting perspectives, to make the complexity of the situation come forward, and to make it more obvious how we know what we think we know.
Exactly. And there's a transparency there where you can see the conversations, where you can see the logs, you can see how many people edited, you can check the reference sources and look at all the statistics. That's a really important feature. You can see how the knowledge was summarized and codified, and how the disputes got resolved. And it's absolutely fascinating. And there are people that are much more expert than me than I am, but I just feel like this passion to advocate for that people should learn more about it. Yes, it works. It's really interesting. It's complicated. You could spend a very long time diving deeply into it, but what's incredible is you don't have to, and it still works. Most people, and it's being a large website, are the ones who are visiting it. I use it all the time. I love it, but I'm almost never actually editing it, very, very rarely. And it's hard. It's hard to add something that, to find something unless you're really, really dedicated. So I haven't made, I can't take credit for what so many Wikipedians have done. I'm just kind of in awe of the project, and think we've got a lot to learn from it. And it's a solution. It's very complementary. We can take the best of it. Yeah, actually, it's interesting because the whole integral thing, which I don't know that much about. I think you're maybe like the third or fourth integrator who I've met, but I've found myself having these great conversations, and I think to some extent, Wikipedia is an incredible integration machine, or integral machine, in that it can cover so many different areas of knowledge, and kind of do it accurately, filter out the parts that aren't accurate descriptions pretty well. And so that I find it also interesting that there seems to be some natural relationship, by broad-minded, generalist thinkers and philosophers that appreciate and approach it. The other area that's of people that are very Wikipedia friendly, whether they want to be open about it or not, is in medicine. It's Wikipedia is the largest medical source of knowledge in the world. It's used by 90% of medical students. They do a lot of studies on it because it's sort of an open secret, and they want to see how accurate and complete is Wikipedia. And so a lot of the studies that I've seen when I was researching this and really looking into it are in areas like pharmacology, right? Where it's really important that if you're going to use it as a reference text, to know the answer to that. And the studies are, it's very, very accurate, high 90% accurate, as or more accurate than anything. The only place where it's, more in the 80s or so is how comprehensive is it, right? It may not include absolutely everything. You might want to go dig up that really, really detailed reference text on, some particular area of pharmacology if you want 100% or whatever, 90% instead of 84% or whatever, right? So that's another area where there's a lot of natural interest and use. And medicine also, you can't be an expert on like medicine, right? It's just too complicated. There's too many fields, and it gets more and more specialized, right? The specializations you have today and that you'll have tomorrow are more specialized. So I'm just drawing some interesting connecting the thread between that world and integrators and the integral machine. That,
there's a natural affinity, I think, and there's talking with you, I get the sense that there's something that the filtration aspect is maybe underemphasized in general among iterative developmental models, right? Because there's obviously a close parallel in terms of, hey, we think people go through phases of emergent development and complexification that are basically catalyzed by the right kind of interaction between an increasing number of perspectival capacities that become built in, and it undergoes these, if it happens, then it undergoes these periodic punctuated transformations. But there's not a lot of discussion in there about what you want to keep out in order to facilitate that process. And that's something that I think these kind of models can really, foreground for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have a few more minutes? Do you have to go?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I just maybe would ask a couple of personal questions, which is, you're clearly a guy who is strongly drawn to systemic phenomenon, whether political, technological, informational. Where does that come from? How did you get interested in it? When did that kind of stuff start to stand out for you as a thing that could be thought about?
Oh, that's an interesting question. You're absolutely right. I do love complex sort of symbolic systems. I think maybe it started with language to some degree. Got really interested in language and learning other languages, and was kind of adventurous. But yeah, just trying to. I love learning and learning about a lot of different topics. So some people with some enough depth, right, to feel some satisfaction, but at the same time, maybe I'm not the kind of person where I want to spend the rest of my career just looking at one problem deeper and deeper and deeper, and so that maybe that's one reason why my career kind of has gone in the directions that it has. They've allowed me to be a little bit more generalist, to write a book or to build to be an entrepreneur, and build a tech company. And so actually one of my colleagues gave me a book for my birthday called Range, about, I don't know if you've seen that book, but it's all about kind of generalists, and it looks at actually athletics and different intellectual areas, and shows some very interesting stories of people that had a lot of experience in across different sports or across different areas, and were able to, a little bit later in their careers, really kind of synthesize things, and that the author argues that helped them to create something new and at new, interesting, like higher levels, and that was really interesting, because there's so much focus on specialization for obvious reasons. There's benefits to that too. But it made me feel a little bit better. So for anyone out there who's, like a little bit of a generalist or is trying to integrate, I recommend that book, Range. It was a good one.
Nice. I feel like I'm going to end this the same way Carter Phipps ended it, which is, I'd love to have a discussion with you about the evolution of political dispositions, as you worked on in your book, Our Political Nature. But I'd like to ask one question about that, which is, have your views on that evolved at all since you wrote that book? Or, what do you feel like you know now about those topics that you didn't know when you put that book together, if anything?
Yeah, they have it has a lot. And as I mentioned just a little bit ago, generally when people spend more time reading or doing more education, they tend to kind of get stronger ideological coherence, which is a whole spectrum of its own, and they tend to get a little bit maybe more into politics in one direction or another. And certainly I've had times in my life when I was a little bit more active or a little bit more passionate. But what happened to me in doing all that research and going through the book and trying to write a science book about human political orientation is the same thing that happened to a lot of the readers of that book that have told me the same thing, which is, it provides like some distance. And I've kind of thought, like, what if you're like an anthropologist for another planet? You're trying to understand why human beings have these differences and see the world differently, and different behaviors and so forth. You're trying to explain it. You're trying to analyze it, and it tries very hard not. I'm sure some people feel like maybe feel like there's some kind of point of view or something, but it tries very hard not to be prescriptive or tell people what's right or wrong. It's trying to explain it. And that process of distance and looking at it scientifically and kind of understanding the ultimate logic, like the evolutionary forces that molded different tendencies, I believe has shown that there's a reason, why people do the things they do. There's been forces across time and space that have sort of prioritized certain tendencies. And a lot of these, there's tensions, right? There's not an optimal solution to personality, for example, right? If you think of something like, I don't know, like how levels of anxiety, right? Like you don't want to have no anxiety about anything because you'll get hurt, but if you're too anxious, that's not adaptive either, right? And so actually the distributions of traits is they have pretty normal, interesting or not interesting distributions. And so the answer, I think, is really I feel like I've gotten a lot out of my system. Like it's easier to talk to people with different views. I mean, I haven't. It's not that I'm not judgmental. I'm still probably a little bit judgmental, and especially when views have lead to bad ideas. But I feel like maybe my level of bias is decreased. I don't think that like one side has all the right answers and the other has all the wrong answers. I think that it's important to look at things from different perspectives and to have those debates. And I certainly would like social media to continue to be a place where that can happen, right? Like I don't know what the answer is. I'm not an economist. I don't know how much money we should be spending or not spending, but there's different levels of conscientiousness, and that's important. There should be, because these are complex questions, and there's hopefully we can talk through them, and especially people that also bring data and specialized knowledge and of history and everything into those conversations. But all I'm suggesting is that we get rid of the small parts that are kind of mythological or harmful, that don't contribute to that. That would help, and kind of legitimize the important dialogue and conversations between different points of view. And so, of course, you want to keep that. And part of why I'm suggesting this quite passionately is, if we don't solve the problem, then social media platforms will get pushed around by governments, whether it's legitimate regulation in different countries, or if just bullying and intimidation, right? If you've got a lot of power in a country, political power, you can kind of have some say over who's allowed to do business there. And so you don't want that to happen. You want people to be able to have legitimate, open conversations. And so solving the problem will help ensure that we continue to be able to, I think, enjoy those benefits and that we do have.
Yeah, I think so too. If we don't find democratic type solutions, then we're definitely going to get autocratic or oligarchic type solutions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just incredible when you have the distributing power with rules and safeguards actually gets a great result. And when you don't do that, right, you get really bad results. You get authorities trying to cover things up, trying to use propaganda, trying to, I don't know, make sure athletes don't criticize their coaches and like make them, all kinds of, ugly things happen, right? That aren't really in the public interest. And it's a little bit scary, like making things open source, but I think we can see a very strong track record that if you do that in certain ways, that it turns out quite well. In fact, not just quite well, actually like best practice, better than really any other alternative, and can centralize it. And it's just a phenomenal tool I hope, for the long, life and success and sustainability of that tool itself, right? So I think I'm just looking for a real win-win. I'd like Wikipedia to win. I'd like the social media companies to become better, and basically they can keep things kind of the way they are and become better, reduce their problems, the headaches. You don't want them in this slow motion train wreck with political power. And that's what we're seeing. And this is why I think there's a better solution. And I'm sure there's a lot of different ways to solve the problem, but I'm very convinced that you need.
Wikipedia makes a great symbol or archetype for this, right? Because it's very difficult for a lot of people to think systemically, let's say, right? And so you go, well, in general, there could be better procedures for sense making. I don't know what to do with that. But you go, oh, well, Wikipedia, that's a thing I know about. It exists. Even if I'm suspicious of it, I probably do use it. So I have a kind of high degree of visceral reliability there. And I go, yeah, no, maybe something like that can work. It's something I've heard about, something that seems to be okay. Maybe we can implement solutions like that. So I think it's really good to have a discourse that puts that thing out there as an example of what we might be able to do. And fantastic. Nice talking with you. I'd love to have you back to talk about evolutionary political polarization and how mythological and rational mindsets play together. There's a lot of interesting topics we could get into, but this is enough for today. It's been great getting to know you, and thanks for talking with us, Avi.
Oh, well, thanks, Layman. It's truly my pleasure. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks again for having me.